On July 7, 1994, Blake Patton, who supervises security for the Forest Service, received news that a woman hiking with her family found a human skull near Smokehouse Campground, close to Forest Service Road 402, also known as Divide Road, in Colorado. The campers discovered the skull and jaw at Windy Point. The report was passed to investigator Mike Wiggins and a team trained in forensic investigation to search for more remains. As they searched, they found additional bones belonging to a woman who was about 5 feet, 6 inches tall. The woman's skull had clues to her identity, like gold crowns and signs of temporomandibular syndrome. There were signs of scoliosis in some parts of the spine. They also found the sacrum, the tailbone, parts of the arm and shoulder bones, and most of the right hip. Most of the bones that were found showed signs of being chewed on by carnivores. Various things were found near the body, such as a piece of a belt and a lock of hair that suggested she was either a brunette or a redhead. Investigators thought that some of the remains might have been concealed. What was left showed no signs of injury before death. The report from the autopsy said that a lot of the bones were still missing. Agreed in September 1994 that the woman was at least 35 and possibly over 40, based on how her bones and teeth looked. Her face looked like it belonged to a Caucasian woman. Pickering even found grooves that pointed to a receding gum line, which could have been caused by using a toothpick at the time. He also found damage from carnivores, in the form of pieces being broken off, cracks, and chewing. Pickering said that the person died within a year of when they were found. He told them, "From what I understand, these bones were found on the ground, so it would have started to break down and be eaten by carnivores almost right away." The ID was the most important thing he couldn't figure out. William Rodriguez, who worked as a forensic anthropologist for the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in 1995, couldn't figure it out either. At the time, Canfield was the forensic pathologist at Montrose Memorial Hospital. He asked for a reconstruction of the face. William Rodriguez did the reconstruction and sent it back to Montrose with the bones and what little information he could get from them. He said that they didn't find any clues that would help with the investigation. They hoped facial reconstruction would help find the person who did this. But in reality, it did not do much. The investigators did their best, but they didn't find anything in the end. The detectives didn't give up hope as they kept working on the case and looking for new clues. But over time, no one could do anything about the case, and it became known as the Windy Point Jane Doe case. Investigators were still doing their best, but just like in the beginning, when they added the victim's DNA to the combined DNA index system, they found nothing. DNA science and technology kept getting better and better. Canfield sent bone, dry tissue, and hair fragments to the CBI to see if they could be used to make a DNA profile. However, he said in 2008 that he had nothing that could be used to compare the samples to identify the dead person. As the years went by, Canfield and the police asked the public repeatedly for any clue, no matter how small, that could lead to the Windy Point Jane being identified. Even though there was a lot of publicity and a second facial reconstruction done in 2012, no new information solved the case. But DNA technology kept improving and it was used in more places than just law enforcement and medicine. Canfield said that they would keep the proof until science had caught up with it. Before that, people who wanted to discover their possible ancestry could send a DNA sample to a business that did genealogy research. This became increasingly popular because it helped people find relatives and find out their family trees. It was also sometimes used by the police. Even though the investigators had her DNA, they were not able to run it through the genealogy. In 2020, MCSO investigators Dustin Harlow and Brittany Martinez asked Lieutenant Ted Valerio for permission to send a DNA sample to the CBI for a family tree test. Valerio permitted them, and Lillard was happy to pay the $5,000 cost. In 2021, Lillard said that the CBI had chosen Windy Point as one of about 100 cold cases where it would be used. They thought it might be a good idea. Then on April 19th, the CBI called them. Lillard said that they asked me if I was sitting down because they had some excellent news. After working hard and waiting, they finally found a match. He said that submissions to one of the commercial databases for which the CBI made the sample came from the sister and brother of the Hops family. With the DNA and dental records, forensic scientist Denise Wenzel from the CBI confirmed that the remains were those of Susan Hops. The Windy Point Jane Doe was finally identified as Susan Hopps. When the investigators met Susan's family, they learned who Susan Hopps was, since she was 11 years old. In the summer of 1991, when she was 41, she moved to Lakewood, Washington with a woman who was said to be a possible roommate. In 1992, when she was 44, she was happy to buy a trailer. It was the first time she had lived on her own. At some point, they would be joined by a male friend. Even though she was far away from where she came from, she stayed in touch with her family. Because Susan's trailer was so important to her, it was strange that she would just abandon it. When the mobile home park owner came to her trailer to collect the rent, the door was wide open and trash was all over the place. The drawers were opened. Susan and her 2 roommates seemed to have left the trailer. Susan's family was from California, but she had an aunt and uncle in Washington who were worried about her. They always talked to Susan and said she lived a pretty calm life. They said she wasn't at high risk for something like this. They were confused about what actually happened to her. They said they started knocking on doors and asking people if they'd seen her. It was said that whatever they found out was strange, including details which had been kept from the public. Susan's family also put an ad in a newspaper saying that her father was very sick and that Susan should call them wherever she was. No call ever came. Susan was 44 years old when she was last seen in Lakewood, Washington on August 9, 1993. It said that she and 2 other people left quickly for some reason. There was a chance that the identity of those 2 individuals was known, but it wasn't released. It looked like Susan had vanished into thin air. In 2003, her family hired a private investigator, but she could not be found. Amy Johnson was the private investigator who had been looking for her, and when Susan's brother or sister's DNA was finally found, she was notified. Amy was the one who put the information on GED Match, which was a good idea. Amy Johnson thought at first that the call from the Colorado number was spam, but when she heard the message, it was precisely what she had been looking for. That the Windy Point's Jane Doe in Montrose County was really Susan. Susan had always been important to her. Amy never got paid for working on this case. Amy told the press that her goal had always been to help Susan get what was right. The best thing that could have happened was for her to be found. She said, "I've never forgotten about her. Even 20 years later, her picture hangs in a place where I see her. I've always wondered, where are you?" Since 2003, she had been looking into possible leads. Amy said that all of it was for Susan. She was a really wonderful person. She fell in with the wrong crowd. No one wanted a member of their family to be found on a hillside. This woman was kind and didn't deserve what happened to her. After years of hard work and dedication, Susan was found after 28 years. But the main point remains that her case is still being looked into, as the cause of death is believed to be murder, and the killer is yet to be found. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On Saturday, December 10th, 1988, the body of a young woman was found on Bayside Drive in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. It was on the bike path, and the people who cleaned it were the first to find it. They didn't waste much time and called the police right away. When the police arrived, they started looking around the whole area. When they talked to some people in the area, the police discovered that there was a cleanup event on Saturday along Bayside Drive. After the investigation was over, the police found a skeleton and some pieces of clothes and shoes, but they didn't know who the bones belonged to. Donna Fontana, a forensic anthropologist for the state of New Jersey, then looked at the remains and concluded that they belonged to a young white female between the ages of 15 and 18 who had probably been dead since the mid-1970s. Members of the MCPO and the Atlantic Highlands Police Department first looked into the case together. They used different methods of investigation, but none of them were able to find out the identity of the deceased. In the 1990s, a DNA profile was made from the bones and used to make comparisons, which also didn't work at first. In their investigation of this case, the police always came up with nothing, but they didn't give up looking. They were always talking to people in Atlantic Highlands, but they still couldn't get a break in this case. Eventually, the case turned cold with no new leads. Then in 2020, Lieutenant Andrea Tosi and Detective Wayne Rayner of the MCPO contacted Bode Technology, a Virginia-based DNA analysis company, to look into the case using much more advanced technology than had been available before. The person who had been known only as Jane Doe for a long time was finally found to have a distant relative who lived in Georgia and was a woman. The relative agreed to an interview and then agreed to put DNA from her mother into the Bode's database, which led to the discovery of another lead. A Pennsylvanian woman was thought to be Jane Doe's youngest sister. The woman was talked to in August and agreed to give a DNA sample. The test results meant that there was a 99.9997% chance that Jane Doe was related to the person immediately. The Middlesex Regional Medical Examiner Office's Deputy Medical Examiner, Dr. Lauren Tama, then looked at the new information and made it official that the remains were those of Nancy Fitzgerald. The investigation had been looking for this for decades. After that, Nancy Fitzgerald's relatives who were still alive were told, and her body was sent to them to be buried. Finally, the detectives could get in touch with them and talk to them. They learned more about Nancy Fitzgerald after that. Nancy Carol Fitzgerald was born in New Jersey and grew up in Essex County. Her mother and father had her in 1956. In 1968, her father died. She moved from Crown Street to Moore Avenue in Bloomfield, New Jersey, with her mother and siblings. She went to Berkeley Elementary School and North Junior High School in Bloomfield. She was kicked out of school because of drug use at a young age. A person used to sell drugs to her and other girls in exchange for prostitution. In 1971, she overdosed and was rushed to a hospital by police. When she was taken home, police found barbiturates in her bedroom that she was supposed to sell. On the 2nd of April, 1972, Nancy had Easter dinner with her family at their home in Bloomfield. This was the last time they had seen Nancy, because the next day, on the 3rd of April, she went missing. She was 16 years old at the time. On the night of the 3rd of April, her mother and sister called the police. The police began to look into it. When Nancy went missing, she was wearing knee-high socks, a lace-covered bra, and platform sandals with ankle straps made of leather. She regularly went to the dentist because she had a gap in her upper central incisors. After she had been gone for a year, her mother got a phone call from a strange girl. The girl had begged and screamed for help, saying, "Mom, I made a big mistake. Come get me help." Nancy's mother had thought she was Kathleen, as they had lost hope of finding Nancy by this time. But when Kathleen came home that night safely, her mother realized who it could have been. They contacted the police again, but just as in the past, the police couldn't find anything. Nancy's sister Kathleen traveled the country to search for Nancy over the years, but she also failed to find her sister. Finally, decades later, they got to know what happened to her. In 2020, with the results of DNA testing, Raymond Santiago, the prosecutor from Monmouth County, said in a statement, "Today's announcement results from decades of hard work by a network of people whose collective determination and creativity proved to be unstoppable. It's also a sign of our firm commitment to find the truth and serve the interests of justice, no matter how much time has passed or what obstacles might ever get in the way of an investigation." 50 years later, thanks to modern DNA testings and interviews with far-off relatives in Georgia and Pennsylvania, authorities have confirmed that Fitzgerald's remains were located after all these years. Haley Dunn, a 13-year-old from the small town of Colorado City, Texas, came from a close-knit community of around 4,000 people. Her father Clint described her as a tomboy who also enjoyed sparkly and beautiful things. Her mother Billie Jean remembered Haley for her infectious laugh, big smile, and sense of humor. Haley was known as a bright and lively teenager. Her friends described her as someone who loved to joke around and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She was involved in various activities including cheerleading, playing the saxophone, and excelling as an athlete. Haley enjoyed school, cherished her friendships, and admired her teachers. By the time she was in 8th grade, she was actively playing on the volleyball, basketball, and softball teams. Her parents would separate when she was 10, and Haley and her older brother David went to live with their mother and her boyfriend, Sean Adkins, on Chestnut Street in Colorado. Haley and her dad Clint were especially close. Clint lived just across the road from them, and Haley would swing by his house every day. Whether it be just popping in to say hi before school or staying over for dinner, she never missed an opportunity to spend time with him. Christmas Day 2010, Haley's grandmother Connie said that Haley was in great spirits that day. She was excited about the gifts she had received that year, especially her new iPod, and spent most of Christmas and Boxing Day with her father. During the evening on Boxing Day, David, Haley's 16-year-old brother, went to a friend's house for a sleepover. Haley stayed at home and played video games into the night. The following morning, December 27th, Sean left for work at 5:30 a.m. Billie Jean also left about an hour later to start a 12-hour shift. She said she checked in on Haley, who was sound asleep in her bed. Everything appeared to be fine. Billie said that Haley would be home alone all day, as she and Sean would be out at work, and she assumed that when Haley got up, she would simply head over to her dad's house as she normally would. Billie also left her cell phone at home so the children could use it if they needed to. Sean arrived at his job in Snyder at around 6 a.m. He then said he got into a bad fight with his boss 10 minutes after he arrived and ended up quitting on the spot, before heading to his mother's house in Big Spring, and then to Colorado City just before 3 p.m. Haley's father Clint was used to seeing his daughter every day, but on December 27th Haley didn't knock his door, and he didn't hear from her all day. At around 2 o'clock that afternoon, a text was sent from the cell phone left at the house to a friend of Haley's saying, "WID, what you doing?" This friend never replied. Later that evening, Sean picked Billie up from work. Billie said that when she got home, she realized Haley wasn't in the house. She asked Sean if he had seen her. He said that Haley had left the house on foot to go to her father's, and then had plans to stay the night at her friend Mary Beth's house. But Clint confirmed this definitely wasn't the case. The next morning came and went, and Haley was still not home. Billie decided to phone Mary Beth's parents, who confirmed they hadn't seen Haley at all, and she definitely didn't spend the night with them. Nothing was missing from Haley's room, and certain things everyone would have expected her to take if she was staying at someone's house were all still there. Billie started going door to door, asking everyone if they had seen her daughter, but no one had. Billie said she was scared that maybe someone had driven past and snatched her while she was walking to a store, and she even wondered if maybe Haley had been in a bad mood, which resulted in her storming out of the house that day. A missing persons report was filed on the afternoon of the 28th of December. Investigators initially classed Haley's disappearance as a runaway, but a short while later, her case was reclassified as a missing child case. This was a decision that the police would later receive immense backlash for making. The community rallied around the family and sprung into action to try and find Haley. The media quickly ran with the story too. Clint was devastated and distraught at his daughter's disappearance, and he spent every waking moment looking for her. He rifled through dumpsters, searched the streets and alleyways and anywhere else he could think of. People reported that this level of concern was not shared by Billie and Sean. As the searches expanded into more vast and open areas, reporters recalled that Billie didn't want to partake in these searches. Billie herself said that whilst she was happy to hand out flyers and talk to the media, she couldn't deal with looking in wooded areas or fields because that made her think they were looking for her daughter's body. Searching these more rural areas was also something that Clint struggled to do. Billie's boyfriend Sean, however, didn't even hand out flyers, let alone participate in the searches, and he was very far removed from the investigation. Numerous people were questioned, including registered sex offenders in the area, but everyone was quickly ruled out. Wednesday, December 29th, Clint and Billie's homes were searched, and a day later, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got involved in the case. Dogs managed to track Haley's scent throughout the neighborhood, which led them to a nearby motel. But the staff there did not recall seeing Haley, and she wasn't seen on any of the surveillance footage either. A thorough search of all 24 suites in the building failed to produce any evidence that Haley had ever been there. Billie and Sean threw a New Year's Eve party on the 31st, just 4 days after Haley was reported missing, and many people were confused at the timing of this. Billy said she didn't even realize it was New Year's Eve, and that the reason that family and friends came over was to support her. But Clint had a different take. He said that he stood on his porch with binoculars looking for his daughter, watching Billy and Sean party into the night. "I don't see how you can just celebrate the new year when your daughter is missing," he said. "That should be the last thing on your mind." As the new year rolled around, the close community entered it with a somber and subdued feeling. With still no trace, sighting of, or word from Haley Dunn, the lengthy and painstaking searches continued. On January 4th, 2011, Texas Rangers and the FBI came on board to look into Haley's disappearance. More than 100 billboards featuring Haley's picture and information were set up throughout Texas and other states. Haley's case gained even more attention when Nancy Grace reported on it and interviewed Billie Jean Dunn. This took the case to a new national level. The following day, January 5th, Billy asked Sean to leave the home. This was not an uncommon thing, as the pair frequently rolled, often making up a few days later. But as the investigation was now deepening, more about Haley's home life started to come out. Reporters said that although her home life appeared to be simple and carefree from the outside, behind closed doors, it was far more complex and difficult for the 13-year-old and her brother. One reporter said, "We got word about a lot of alcohol, a lot of partying from her mother, and so you get the sense that maybe home life was a little harder than what they let on." Billie Jean Dunn and Sean Atkins had been on the police's radar long before Haley disappeared. Around 10 months before Haley was last seen, calls were made to police regarding a domestic disturbance between Billy and Sean. The pair both called the police to report each other, and when officers arrived at the house, the couple were argumentative and combative. Shortly after this, as was very common, Billy and Sean patched things up, and Sean moved back into the home. Billy herself said that Haley didn't see Sean as a stepdad or father figure, and they were more friends than anything else, but according to others close to Haley, she did not like Sean at all and felt afraid of him. She told her grandmother Connie that she would often see Sean's shadow in the middle of the night outside her bedroom door, and she was terrified that he would enter her room as she slept. Detectives asked Billy and Sean to undertake polygraph tests. They both had to retake the tests due to being under the influence of narcotics at the time of the first one. But Billy said this was simply an anti-anxiety medication that had been prescribed to her by her doctor. Sean Atkins walked out of the test at least twice, and on the third attempt he only completed stage 1. He said he felt it had become a witch hunt and they were trying to force him into admitting to something he hadn't done. But he did give the detective something. When he was asked about where he thought Haley might be, Sean responded in Scurry County. When asked who the police should be looking at as suspects, he simply replied, "Both of us." The test did show these two answers were truthful, but he refused to explain any further before walking out again and not completing stage 2. The results of Billy's second polygraph test and stage 1 of Sean's both showed that deception was indicated on several questions. Over the coming months, vigils and searches continued throughout Colorado City, but the volunteers were often hindered for weeks at a time due to the freezing temperatures. Colorado City Police then held a press conference. They said they were now investigating the case as if Haley was under duress or deceased. Early into the investigation, cell phone and bank records belonging to both Sean Atkins and Billie Jean Dunn were analyzed. Sean's previous place of work was also looked at. It turned out that Sean hadn't been fired from his job after all. His boss told investigators that Sean turned up for work at 6 a.m. on December 27th and bought a drink before handing in his uniform and quitting on the spot. And at 6:10, he drove away. Sean later admitted he had lied about being fired to try and avoid an argument with Billie Jean. Sean told detectives that he went straight from Snyder to his mother's house in Big Spring to use her computer to sign on to unemployment benefits. But cell phone records showed this was simply not possible. Between 6:35 and 6:56 a.m., Sean's phone pinged off of a tower in Colorado City, which was almost 50 miles away from Big Spring. The data did put him in Big Spring, but not until between the hours of 9:38 a.m. and 2:40 p.m. More cell phone tower pings also put Sean in the area of Scurry County that day. Sean told police that after visiting his mother's house, He was back in Colorado City by 3 p.m. and saw and spoke to Haley for the last time at 3:15 before she left to go to her father's. However, more mobile data confirmed that Sean was still in Big Spring at 2:40 p.m., which would have left him with just a 20-minute window to make a 40-mile drive. David, Haley's brother, said when he returned home on December 27th at around 4 p.m., he found the door was locked. He managed to enter the home through a window. David found Sean standing in the hallway, looking like a deer in headlights. In an affidavit, Haley's uncle recalled a conversation he had with Sean regarding her disappearance. Her uncle said he couldn't believe anyone would ever want to hurt a child. Sean replied, "It's like killing a deer." Bank records showed that after Sean picked up Billy from work at around 6 p.m., the couple stopped at 2 ATM machines, where Billy withdrew a total of $140. Billy originally told the police that the money was withdrawn to buy groceries and gas, but investigators later realized the pair used the money to buy narcotics. Concerned that Sean and Billy were potentially using narcotics inside the family home around children, detectives wanted to take a much closer look inside the house. Following this, detectives found that Billy and Sean had printed hundreds of articles found online, all of which profiled and talked about serial killers, sexual sadism, and family member murders. But Billy said this was just something they were interested in, and that plenty of people were into true crime. On January 12, 2011, it was revealed that Sean was now officially being considered a person of interest in the case. He, however, denied any involvement. David was then removed from the home by Child Protective Services. On February 24th, authorities made a shocking find. Over 100,000 images of child pornography on a memory stick were found in Billy's home and on a computer in Sean's mother's house. A laptop was also seized and held at the station. Haley's father, Clint, said that Sean's stepfather went to the police station demanding the laptop be returned to Sean, which it was. Arrests were not made regarding these findings, however, but it was presented to a grand jury. Sheriff Toombs said of this, "You have more than one person in the home in each case, so you have to make sure and verify who is going to be the one responsible." On March 17, 2011, authorities went to Billy and Sean's home to talk to Sean. Billy said he wasn't there, but when officers entered the home using a warrant, they found he was hiding inside the house. Billy was then arrested and charged with lying to the police. In June 2011, Billie Jean Dunn was sentenced to a suspended 90-day jail term and a year's probation for lying about Sean's whereabouts. Billie served her probation over 250 miles away in Travis County, where she had moved with Sean. The couple did eventually break up in 2012 and went their separate ways. After it was confirmed that, as well as local police, the FBI also considered him to be a person of interest. As time went on, searches for Haley began to dwindle. With each vigil that was held, tips and leads would slowly start to trickle in, only for the case to go cold again shortly after. Another year would pass with still no movement in Haley's case. But on March 16, 2013, a hiker found human remains 20 miles away from Colorado City, near Lake J.B. Thomas in Scurry County. Authorities did not confirm the cause of death, but Clint said he was told by investigators that Haley had most likely died from blunt force trauma. A $15,000 reward was offered for any information leading directly to the arrest of the killer or killers of Haley Dunn. Sadly, the family had to wait a painful 4 years until they could finally lay Haley to rest in January of 2017. In 2018, Clint Dunn told the media he believed his daughter was attacked, either by Sean himself or by his ex-wife Billie Jean Dunn, while Sean assisted. "They're both involved," he said. "That's not even up for discussion anymore." Clint was constantly in touch with the police, begging them to make an arrest in his daughter's case. But the investigating team still needed more. Clint Dunn's many appeals on social media caught the attention of an anonymous person who reportedly found several items belonging to Haley Dunn during late spring, early summer of 2011. The person who found the items was in middle school at the time and had no knowledge of Haley or her disappearance. Because of this, they did not tell the authorities about what they had found. In 2019, this person saw one of Clint's social media posts about Haley. It was only then they remembered what they had found. They reached out to Clint to tell him. The items and their location has not been publicly revealed, but Clint said they were found in an area that was searched countless times in the initial stages of the investigation. Private investigator Erica Morse has been working closely with Clint Dunn since his daughter disappeared. Erica said she uncovered evidence and spoke to officials, but said they had been silent since Haley's remains were found. She said they wouldn't return her calls or update anyone on whether there was any movement in the case. In October 2019, Erica said she began receiving messages from women in and around West Texas who were being harassed online by a man going by the name of Casey. Knowing this was Sean Atkins' middle name, she asked them to send the videos and photos to her that he had sent to them. These confirmed that it was him. On October 28, 2019, Erica accompanied one of the women that was being harassed by him to the police department to make a report. But they were turned away by an officer who accused the victim of fabricating the story. This pushed Erica to pen an open letter, urging that if Sean wasn't arrested soon, more victims would undoubtedly follow. But 2 more years would pass, and it wouldn't be until 2021, where the case would take a big turn. In May 2021, Erica did hear back from the Mitchell County District Attorney, and they requested a meeting with her and Clint. Erica said, "During that meeting, we were assured that during the month of June, Haley's killer would be arrested." And with this, more than a decade after Haley Dunn was reported missing, and 7 years after her remains were found, an arrest was finally made. District Attorney Ricky Thompson consulted with the Texas Rangers' Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program regarding the case. The Texas Rangers then obtained a search warrant to get a sample of Sean's DNA. On June 13, 2021, a warrant was issued and Sean Casey Atkins was arrested and charged with the murder of Haley Dunn. Billy Dunn said, "I'm not really shocked at the news that it was Sean. Of course you would have hoped it wasn't him because I stayed with him after she left, after Haley went missing, but I'm not surprised, and I thank God that person has been apprehended and is going to pay for what he did here on Earth." Sean Atkins is currently being held on a $2 million bond, and as of July 2021, he has not yet entered a plea. Following Sean's arrest, Erica Morse referred to Haley's dad Clint as the driving force in the case, and said that he was a template for every parent who wants to find justice for their child. Clint said, "This case is still ongoing. The family hopes that this will see that justice for Haley Dunn is finally served." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Philip Peters was born in 1869, and he married Helen Peters, who was born in 1872, during the 1890s. By 1941, they had been living together for over 4 decades in a small brick home at 3335 West Moncrief Place in Denver, Colorado. Philip worked as an auditor at the Denver station for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway from 1891 until his retirement in 1930. They had one adult child, Philip Peters Jr., who was married and lived in Grand Junction, Colorado. Both Helen and Philip shared a passion for music. Philip played the mandolin and was involved in a local Denver group for guitar and mandolin players, where they organized concerts and practiced together. One could say that the couple led a pleasant, quiet, and modest life. Helen Peters fractured her hip in September 1941, and she had to stay in the hospital while recovering, leaving 71-year-old Philip at home alone. He visited his wife in the hospital every day, and his neighbors kept an eye on him, assisting him around the house and inviting him over for breakfast and dinner. His neighbors from across the street on Friday, October 17th. Peter was late on this occasion, which was unusual for him. Mrs. Ross then crossed the street to see what was delaying Peter and to make sure that everything was all right with him. When she went to the front door and saw there were no lights on inside the house, she grew worried. She knocked at the front door but got no response. She thought about breaking in, but she didn't want to do it alone. Suddenly, she saw her neighbor, Doris Burke. She immediately asked for her assistance in getting access to the house and suggested entering through the backyard. The two then climbed over the fence at the back to unlock the door. As Mrs. Ross entered the home and turned on the kitchen light, she discovered a horrifying scene. She saw gory streaks on the ground and shrieked at the sight of blood splattered up the walls. She peeked through the doorway into the front room of the house, but Philip was nowhere to be seen. When she entered the bedroom, Philip Peters was lying face down in front of her. Doris, who had also entered with her, was shocked at the horrifying scene. Both ladies were in a state of shock, but they soon called the other neighbors for help. Then they finally contacted the Denver Police Department to report the murder. Captain James E. Childers, along with 3 patrol cars, arrived on the scene within a few minutes. They first took a look around the property to see if there were any clues that could help them find the murderer. Philip Peters had been struck 37 times with a blunt weapon, leaving blood splattered on the walls of the kitchen, living room, and bedroom where his body lay. Many of his wounds were lacerations to his forearms, indicating that he defended himself against an attacker as best he could. There was a shattered walking stick on the floor near the body, indicating that he had attempted to fight back. During the search, as authorities attempted to piece together a picture of the crime, they got rather perplexed due to a lack of information, particularly on the house's entry points. The neighbors were only able to enter the house through the back door, as all other windows and doors were shut and showed no signs of forced entry. A small 8 by 15-inch fault panel was found in a closet in the back wall of an upstairs storage room, but it couldn't be opened, even though they tried many times. They did find this suspicious initially, but they thought it was too small for anyone to go through, so they ended up dismissing it eventually. In the kitchen, detectives discovered parts of a handgun on the floor and what seemed to be an out-of-place cast iron stove shaker. Assuming that the iron poker was the primary murder weapon, it was submitted to a laboratory for fingerprint analysis and any other possible forensic evidence it may have concealed. The cops initially suspected the motive to be robbery, but when they found $208 in unpaid profits and $24 in cash in the bedroom, they began to doubt this theory. Over the next few days, they found about $400 all around the house, making robbery even less plausible. Instead, they thought it might have been a revenge killing, but neighbors told the police that the Peters had no enemies and were well-liked and respected in the community after living there for so long. Captain James E. Childers and his team were in charge of the investigation, and they were under pressure to find answers quickly. By October 20th, the police had already arrested 1 suspect and were questioning others, but none of them seemed to be a viable culprit. The first suspect was arrested by Weld County Sheriff Gus Anderson. The man had a record of robbery and breaking and entering. At the time, he had suddenly been seen wearing a high-quality dark blue coat that stood out from the rest of his clothing. But when detectives checked if Peter's jacket collection had something similar to it, they realized it didn't. The man in custody was 64 years old, short, and considered too feeble to have violently attacked Peters. Finally, he was released. The other 2 suspects were similar too. One of them was a man who went door to door in North Denver begging for money. That man was never seen again after the day of the murder, so the police thought he was just a beggar who had left. The stove shaker was returned from the lab and it had no fingerprints on it, but small spots of blood confirmed to the authorities that it was the murder weapon. In many ways, this investigation took 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Police had disproved the robbery theory, but on the other hand, they now had no suspects. The authorities said in a press release that the killer took time to wash his hands and clean the murder weapon, so he had definitely had enough time to rob the house. If he really wanted to rob Peters, they wouldn't have found so much cash and other possessions still in the house. The motive behind the killing still confused them. The investigation had halted by spring. Despite an extensive investigation, the police had no leads. After Mrs. Peters returned from the hospital, things began to escalate. On the 1st of February 1942, Helen Peters returns to Westmont Creek Place. She was alone in her 40-year-old home. Her future was uncertain at 68 years old and recovering from a fractured hip, so she hired 2 nurses to help her around the house. She was helped by Mrs. Edith Clark and Mrs. Hattie Johnson. Helen fell again a few weeks later and was hospitalized yet again with a broken hip. She returned home at the end of April, and the 2 nurses helped her around the house. Edith was the first one who reported suspicious things happening inside the house. She heard noises in the walls, and what she swore were faint footsteps in vacant rooms. Newspapers were missing from the front porch that she had seen earlier, and Mrs. Peters' food trays were moved or rearranged when she maintained she hadn't touched them. Edith wasn't alone in noticing oddities. Mrs. Peters was hard of hearing, but Hattie Johnson, who had nighttime fright, could hear disturbances. Both nurses heard strange sounds on the regular. Mrs. Peters began to suspect that something was off in her home after learning of the nurses' accusations. One day, Edith Clark contacted the police after seeing a person in the stairwell. She also heard tapping sounds coming from over there. She had heard it previously as well, but had believed it was a woodpecker. But this time she went into the kitchen and then to the upstairs stairwell door as it slowly opened. She saw a foot and a thin white hand appear at the door. She screamed in fear as the man ran up the stairs. Despite searching the property, the officers found nothing. 2 police officers stayed in the house for 48 hours and found no evidence of an intruder. Edith Clark resigned after this incident. Within 2 weeks, Hattie Johnson also departed the house, telling the press she wouldn't stay at a haunted house. In May 1941, Mrs. Peters' son, Philip Jr., visited her and tried to convince her to move to Grand Junction. After her nurse's sudden resignations, she moved in with her son and his wife in June 1941. She stopped house utilities and left the home for the police to investigate. 3-3-3-5 West Moncrief Place, that had been Peter and Helen Phillips' home for so many years, was now empty. But the strange occurrences continued after she left. Neighbors noticed the windows' blinds moving. They were lowered and opened at times during the day. People took notice of strange activities, and police received multiple complaints of a shadow walking around at night. Police eagerly responded to calls but found just vacant rooms. 2 officers stood guard outside the house for 5 days, but it was uneventful. The stakeout ended on the 5th day, and they returned to the station with no new information. With Mrs. Peters gone, the patrol checked the property every day, sometimes following up on reports of movement in the windows, and sometimes merely as a matter of habit. The press quickly picked up on the house's peculiar happenings and began referring to the killing as a ghost slaying. The Peters house was now the ghost house of Denver. It stayed in the news for a very long time. The townspeople thought this was just the press making up a headline to sell a story. But the police were investigating a very real mystery. No one had seen or heard the killer. How was Peter slain in a closed house with no forced entry? The investigation was also quickly losing steam as they had no leads and no suspects. On July 30th, 1942, detectives Roy Bloxam and William Jackson were patrolling West Moncrief. They parked in front of the deserted house, as had become customary by this point, and went inside to conduct their routine room searches. This time, however, they both picked up a faint sound coming from upstairs. The 2 men hurriedly climbed the stairs, ran into the bedroom, and entered the tiny back storage space. A pair of legs were climbing up into a small opening in the back of a closet, giving them just enough of a start to frighten them for a brief second. A pale, malnourished man was hauled out by them after they grabbed the dangling feet. He disliked the sunlight, was the color of a mushroom, and behaved like a spider that scurries for darkness when caught hiding under a stone. He was beetle-browed, wide-eyed, and pale as a ghost. String and rope were all that kept his rotting garments from falling apart. They did not try to fire after seeing the condition he was in. The man identified himself as Matthew Cornish and said he had moved to Denver in 1941 from Tonawanda City in New York, where he had worked as an advertiser. Detective Bloxam and Jackson then took him to the station. He stuck to the story for a few hours, right up until he was fed a cheeseburger with coffee. Then, after giving in, he revealed his real identity to be Theodore Edward Coneys, and that led to his acquaintance with and subsequent murder of Philip Peters. On November 2, 1882, Theodore Edward Coneys was born in Petersburg, Maynard County, Illinois. His father, Thomas Coneys, a Canadian immigrant, owned and operated a local hardware store. Isabella, Theodore's mother, was a homemaker. They lived happily as a family until Coneys' father died in 1888. It was a huge shock for his mother, who moved to Beloit, Wisconsin, with her young child. When Theodore was diagnosed with tuberculosis several years later, his life got even more difficult. He had been an ill youngster for a long time. Scared of losing her only family, his mother, Isabella, spoiled her son. He enjoyed sports and aspired to play baseball, but his mother pushed him towards the softer, less physically demanding career of music. While the neighborhood lad swung bats on the school field, he sat at home, wrapped in his overbearing mother's protective blanket, learning to play the mandolin. The physicians had given him the gloomy prognosis that he would not live to reach his 18th birthday, so he dropped out of high school. Isabella Conies relocated to Denver, where she worked as a housekeeper, and Theodore resumed his music, with a large quantity of money left over from her husband's death. Unfortunately, not long after they arrived, she was duped by a con artist who convinced her to invest her husband's fortune and securities before stealing every last penny. The family was shattered as a result, and Theodore got a part-time job to help put food on the table, but it was a dismal living. Isabella Conies died in 1911, leaving Theodore both broken and alone. Theodore met Philip and Helen Peters through music. Philip and Theodore were both members of the same mandolin club. The couple noticed his difficulties coping after his mother's death and befriended him, frequently inviting him for dinner and offering him company. One of his friends introduced Theodore to the Denver Gas and Electric Company, where he began as a pipefitter helper and swiftly advanced to the position of a pipefitter himself. He and his friend were doing well in this job, but they formulated a plan to become advertising men and quit the pipefitting game to start their own firm. Theodore Coney was the company's public face while his partner was the operations brains. Unfortunately, neither side fared well in their responsibilities and they quickly went bankrupt, leaving Denver and traveling across many states, working at various jobs such as insurance and advertising sales. Nonetheless, after battling it out, he eventually began to gradually drift away from society. In 1917, he sought to develop cheap gasoline leases in Texas, but failed again, leading him to become a full-time wanderer and drifter. When he eventually made his way back, it was far from triumphant. He was nothing more than a homeless beggar, and his first stop would be at his old friend's place, the Peters. He hadn't seen them in nearly 30 years, but he knew he could always ask for dinner. After all, they'd been so welcoming to him over the years. In September 1941, Theodore Conies, who was nearly 59 years old at the time, arrived at 3335 West Moncrief Place just in time to watch Philip Peters leave with a neighbor. He was on his way to the hospital to see his wife. Instead of waiting for him, Theodore decided to swing around to the backyard and attempt the back entrance. As luck would have it, it was unlocked, so he strolled inside and helped himself to some food. He spent some time nosing around the Peters house until, in an upstairs storage room, he discovered a little 8 by 15-inch ply wall panel in the top of a closet that functioned as a trapdoor into a tiny coffin-shaped attic that was 37 inches tall at the apex, 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Conies resorted to the narrow crawl space in the rafters instead of leaving. It appeared to be a suitable place to spend the winter, he later told authorities. And this is exactly what he did for several weeks. When Philip was out seeing his wife in the hospital, he would leave the small space in the attic and move around the house. Mrs. Peters' condition was unknown to Coney, but the scenario worked in his favor. Every night, he would listen through a hole until he heard Philip snoring, then crawl out and go to the icebox, taking just enough food to not be noticed. He said he'd take it back to his nest, where he discovered fragments of an antique crystal set and a pair of headphones in one of the closets. He repaired it so it worked, and he listened to all of the music from the newscast. He used to go down to the restroom and shave with the older gentleman's razor. Slowly, when Conies was feeling a bit bored, he thought of doing something funny to entertain himself. He began to follow Philip Peters throughout the home, monitoring his movements and hiding behind doors as he passed for pure enjoyment. On the afternoon of Friday, October 17, 1941, things took a drastic turn when he assumed Peters had gone out to visit his wife in the hospital. Coney slipped out of his cramped living quarters around 4 p.m. and headed to the kitchen to get some food. As it turned out, Peters was simply sleeping. The noise from the kitchen woke him up, so he went to investigate. When the two men met, they were stunned to see each other. Coney stated that he was afraid of losing his sanctuary. Peters didn't recognize him due to the fact that he had changed dramatically in the last 30 years. Coney noticed an ancient handgun hanging on the wall and grabbed it, hitting Peter on the head. Peter fell, but he got up and went to the dining room phone. Coney's followed Peter and punched him again when he stated he would call the cops. Peter was looking for the vials in which he has stashed some money. Coney's noticed him unlocking a drawer in the basement bedroom. He says he went in there with the stove shaker and he didn't know how many times he hit him. He just kept punching him till he stopped moving. After that, he cleansed the iron porker and took some food with him. Then he scurried back to his hiding place rather than running away. 2 hours later, he heard activity downstairs when Mrs. Ross, the neighbor from across the street, discovered Philip Peters' death. Later, on his homemade radio, he listened to the news about the crime. Since Mrs. Peters had trouble hearing, he stayed in the house after she got back, which made life better for him overall. His biggest problem, however, was when she was away after injuring herself again. He was nearly frozen to death. Because there was no heat in the house, but he still remained in his nest. He liked to go down and peek out of the windows watching the postman pass by. He stated that no one had written to him in the last 25 years. He despised people on the street and would retreat to the attic whenever he saw them. When the townspeople witnessed blinds moving, papers being removed from the porch, or movements in the windows, Theodore Coney's unwittingly became the ghost of the Denver ghost slaying. Most people would have left the house with constant patrols checking the home, but Coney's felt different. He'd been in the attic for about 10 months and did not want to leave. The following day, weird stories of the ghost slayer who had lived as a spider in the walls were all over the front pages of the neighborhood newspapers. The press was informed of everything by Captain Childers. Coney's told the police that he was sitting on the little false trapdoor when they first found it inside the home on October 17, 1941, and that he had held it shut with his body weight as they knocked on it before they dismissed it, thinking it was too small for a person to fit through. And in a news interview he gave on August 2, 1942, he continued to offer a very detailed account of his existence in the attic of the Peters. In that attic, it was freezing cold in the dead of winter and excruciatingly hot in the summer, but that was all part of the price he was willing to pay. He had only once left the home throughout the 10 months he had spent living in this cramped attic area, and that was in the middle of the night after Mrs. Peters had departed and the utilities were turned off. He used a toy shovel to gather some snow to fill a bucket with water. He stated that everything would have been okay and Philip Peters would still be alive today if he hadn't been caught robbing the icebox. He was 6 feet tall, but barely weighed 75 pounds when he was taken into custody. Police searched the residence where Coney's had been residing after hearing his confession, and one of them reported being knocked out by the foul odor. According to Detective Fred Sarnoff, a guy would need to be a spider to survive up there for very long. In relation to first-degree murder, Theodore Coney's entered a not guilty plea. Foster Klein, the court-appointed attorney who represented him, said that while Coney's would not contest killing Peters, he sought to avoid the death penalty. This had been demanded by the prosecution from the beginning, but Klein was optimistic because the crime had not been planned and because of Coney's mental state at the time of assault. The actual trial took place over the course of 6 days at the end of October 1942. This was because Coney's was admitted to the hospital with pneumonia on September 21, 1942, and the original trial had to be postponed. Coney's got a psychiatric evaluation while he was being held in jail pending trial, and the results showed that he was fit to stand trial. Klein, however, pleaded with the judge to order an impartial investigation to gather proof that might spare him the death penalty. Coney's had to undergo a second examination after the request was granted, and the results were provided to the judge. Coney's was then referred to see Dr. Leo Tapley. Coney's was found once more to be in good enough condition to be tried in court. The county maintained its composure in the courtrooms throughout the trial, which was largely free of drama and theatrics. The jury was given 90 minutes to deliberate before returning its judgment on Halloween in 1942. Coney's was given a life sentence at the Colorado State Penitentiary with hard labor, and he escaped the death penalty. After the decision was announced, Coney looked at Foster Klein and said, "I now feel secure. I'll live in a better house than I have in a long time. The Associated Press selected the now officially known Ghost Man murder as Colorado's top news story for 1942 on January 1, 1943. After finding his nest in the attic, Konies earns the nickname the Spider-Man of Denver. Additionally, it took some time for him to lose his reputation as the ghost slayer in the media. In the end, Konies passed away on May 16, 1967 in a prison hospital. He was 84 years old when he passed away, and he was cremated and buried in Mountain Vale Memorial Park in Cannon City, Colorado, in an unmarked grave. Carol and Reggie Sumner first met in school when they were young. They had a short romance but went their separate ways after graduation. Many years later, they reconnected, fell in love, and eventually married. Reggie served in the Navy and later found work with the railroad. Carol, on the other hand, was married twice and had children from her marriages. Her first marriage ended in divorce, and her second marriage was very abusive, leading her to file a restraining order against her second husband. Tragically, despite the restraining order, one day her second husband showed up at her home, pulled out a gun, and shot her 6 times. Carol survived, but her husband was chased by police and cornered. He then pulled the trigger and shot himself. Rhonda, Carol's daughter, took care of her mother after the traumatizing ordeal. She was only 10 years old at the time, but as soon as she could, Carol got back into work, holding down multiple jobs to support her family. 40 years passed before Reggie and Carol met again. In 2000, Carol was working at a cable television company when a phone call came in. On the end of the line was none other than her high school sweetheart Reggie. It was like nothing had changed, and the pair quickly became inseparable. A year later, they married in Carol's home. They soon made the move to Jacksonville, Florida. Reggie decided that moving there would be the best thing for his health. Carol agreed, and they began preparing for it. They sold their Chevrolet Lamina to Tiffany Cole, one of their neighbors. The Sumners were very close to Tiffany, having known her since she was a little girl, and they treated her as part of the family. When Tiffany's father became ill, the Sumners stepped in to help, and many said they supported Tiffany like she was their own granddaughter. Tiffany started making monthly payments to the Sumners for the car they had given to her. Once they moved, she would regularly drive to Florida to give them the money and spend some time with them. In early July 2005, Rhonda tried several times to get hold of her mother and stepfather, but her calls were going unanswered. It wasn't long before Rhonda decided she had to make the 4-hour journey to Jacksonville to find out what was wrong. They all spoke every day on the phone, and after almost a week with no contact, Rhonda knew this was troubling. When she reached the house, the couple were nowhere to be seen. On July 10th, Rhonda made the call to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department to report the couple as missing. When law enforcement arrived, they noticed their car was gone and the front door was unlocked. Food was left on the stove, and plates and cutlery were left out too. It looked as if the couple had just picked up and left at a moment's notice. Carol's phone was still plugged in on charge, and her daily planner she never left without was on the table. The pair had also left their dog Mikey as well as all their medication. Carol and Reggie weren't in good health, and departing without any of their medication was a huge cause for concern. Carol had been undergoing debilitating chemotherapy for liver cancer, which stemmed from hepatitis C, something she had contracted whilst undergoing a blood transfusion after being shot by her second husband. She also suffered from diabetes and osteoporosis. Reggie also suffered badly with diabetes and osteoporosis, and due to a break in one of his legs, was virtually confined to a wheelchair. The couple also weighed very little. Everyone was alarmed, and the media quickly ran with the story to get the word out there. Detectives immediately began an investigation, which started inside the house. Financial statements had been left out, and they contacted the banks to see if anything had been withdrawn. They put out a statewide alert for the couple's missing car, and it wasn't long before they got a hit. Just 2 days later, the abandoned Lincoln Town car was found almost 50 miles away from Jacksonville. The car was unlocked, and there were no keys left in the ignition. 5 hours after the car had been found, the police received a bizarre phone call. Police began trying to locate where the call was coming from and who the number was linked to. Another line of inquiry were the bank records. These showed that the couple's card was also active and being used to withdraw money from various ATM machines. Security cameras had captured the people using the card, and the information garnered from the phone analysis told police exactly who to look at. The phone record showed that the number had been used to call a car rental company. The car that was rented matched the car that was seen on some of the CCTV at the ATM machines. The people posing as the missing couple on the phone were none other than Tiffany Cole, Carol and Reggie's old neighbor, and her boyfriend, Michael James Jackson. Through GPS and the rental of the Mazda, the police were directed to a motel in South Carolina. 2 rooms had been rented out under Tiffany's name, and there were 3 people there: Tiffany, Michael, and another man, 18-year-old Alan Lindell Wade. The trio were questioned straight away. Tiffany admitted to participating in a robbery at the Sumners' home, but she and Michael said they knew nothing about where the couple were. Tiffany then suddenly threw a 4th name into the mix: Bruce Kent Nixon. But how and why had this come to be? And where were Carol and Reggie Sumner? When police finally located Bruce Nixon, he told them a shocking and disturbing story. Carol and Reggie had said that Tiffany was always welcome in their home and told her their door was always open. 24-year-old Tiffany and her boyfriend of 2 months, Michael, who was 23, traveled to Jacksonville to visit their friend, Alan Lindell Wade. While they were there, the Sumners happily agreed to give them a place to sleep. During Tiffany and Michael's stay, the Sumners mentioned that they had recently closed the deal on their South Carolina property for just short of $100,000. This would set in motion a frightening and calculated scheme. Michael took note of all the couple's belongings and furnishings in their home and began plotting a sick and twisted robbery. Michael considered breaking into the home while the couple were out of town, but the plan then evolved to them robbing and then killing the couple. They first thought about injecting the pair with a lethal dose of medication. However, that idea was dismissed and they agreed on what would be an unthinkable plan. A month before the Sumners went missing, Alan rented a car to drive to Jacksonville to visit his friend, 18-year-old Bruce Kent Nixon. He told Bruce he had plans to rob someone's house, but didn't give any more details. Bruce stole some shovels from around his neighborhood. They all drove across state lines into Georgia to a remote, wooded location and dug a hole 6 foot deep and 4 foot wide, while Tiffany held the flashlight. Purchases were also made for disposable gloves, plastic wraps, duct tape, and a fake gun. On July 8th at around 10 p.m., the group of 4 left in a rental car, a Mazda RX-8, and drove to the Sumners' home. Tiffany and Michael waited in the car while Alan and Bruce knocked on the door. Carol answered. The pair said they urgently needed to borrow a phone as they were having car trouble. Carol, wanting to help, let them in straight away. As soon as they entered, they aimed the fake gun at the couple. Carol and Reggie, dressed only in their pajamas, were completely terrified and weak due to their health problems. The Sumners cooperated fully, telling the men they could take whatever they wanted as long as they didn't hurt them. Despite this, Reggie and Carol were restrained with duct tape over their eyes, mouth, hands, and feet. Alan also disabled the telephone lines. While the couple were immobile, Alan and Bruce phoned Michael, who was waiting outside. Michael then entered the home and started searching for financial statements. He also took Reggie's prized coin collection. Both Bruce and Alan forced the Sumners into the trunk of their own Lincoln Town car. After this, Michael and Alan drove the Lincoln out to the woods, to the pre-dug hole. The couple had managed to become free of the duct tape and were clutching each other tightly, holding hands and praying. Michael told Bruce to cover their eyes with the tape again, saying it was only a mind thing. He said he didn't want to see their eyes as he killed them. After forcing Carol and Reggie out of the car, they got the PIN to the couple's bank card. Carol then had her jewelry snatched off, before she and Reggie were shoved into the hole next to each other, were then buried alive. Tiffany and Bruce were waiting in the hired Mazda just up the road. The group then drove the Sumners' vehicle to Sanderson, Florida, where they set about removing the evidence and wiping down the inside of the Lincoln before dumping it. They later returned to the couple's home to steal a computer and some more jewelry before checking into a hotel. They spent the night in a limousine, taking pictures with the stolen goods, showing off the cash and drinking bottles of champagne. Through tracking the group via cell phone data and CCTV, On July 14th, just 4 days after Rhonda had reported her mother and stepfather missing, police apprehended Alan, Tiffany, and Michael in a South Carolina hotel. Inside their rooms, they found Carol's car keys, a suitcase containing the financial documents, receipts for items that had been purchased using the couple's money, Reggie's driver's license, credit cards, and checkbooks. Tiffany's car, detectives also found Reggie's coin collection. When Bruce Nixon was located just a day later, he admitted to everything and was more than willing to tell the detectives exactly what had happened and what each individual person's involvement had been. He also told the police he would take them to where the Sumners had been buried. An excavation was carried out and law holding each other. The medical examiner discovered that they had inhaled the dirt until they eventually died of mechanical asphyxiation. The earth they were buried under had compressed their lungs, smothering them. Bruce told the police that he had helped dig the hole, but only found out the following day that the plan was not only to rob the couple, but to bury them alive. Tiffany also claimed that she believed the hole was being dug to hide the stolen goods in, but Bruce said this was nonsense and Tiffany knew exactly what was going to happen to Reggie and Carol. He said that she was the sole connection between everyone involved that night. She also told them all the couple's schedules and she knew they would be home at that time, after a long day at the doctor's. Bruce Nixon was arrested first, and Alan Lindell Wade were subsequently arrested too, and all four were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, armed kidnapping, and armed robbery. While in jail, Michael made a phone call to his grandmother. She read him a newspaper article about Bruce's cooperation with the police. "Bruce just killed us all." Yes, dear. This only added more to the already strong case against them. In court, Carol's daughter asked them not to sentence Alan to death. She also asked for leniency for Bruce, saying that both men had been manipulated by Michael. She said they were too young and were on drugs at the time of the murders. They were used in the worst way. Solving 2 deaths with more deaths does not make me happy. I know in my heart that my mom and Reggie would have felt the same way. Bruce pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to testify against the other 3. Following this, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Michael and Alan received the death penalty. Tiffany's trial took place in October 2007. During the trial, she stated that she had only agreed to the burglary and was totally unaware of the plot to kidnap and kill the couple. She testified that although she did help dig the hole in the ground, she had no idea what it would be used for. She claimed that even as they drove to the wooded area, she had no knowledge that the Sumners were bound in the trunk of the Lincoln. They protested that she was the sole link between the group, and the only person that tied everything together was her. Tiffany didn't believe that she could be guilty of first-degree murder because she didn't personally kill the Sumners, but under Florida law, someone who participates in a crime can be found equally culpable for a murder, even if they didn't directly cause the death. Her defense attorney argued that Michael controlled and manipulated Tiffany during their short-lived relationship, and he was the real mastermind behind what had happened that night. The defense argued that her low intelligence level and mental health issues should also be taken into consideration. But despite hers and her defense's pleas of innocence, the jury took just 90 minutes to deliberate and they ultimately found her guilty. Their verdict was 9-3 for the death penalty. Tiffany is one of the youngest women on death row in the United States. One of the prosecutors on the case, Jay Plotkin, recalled, "I was a prosecutor for more than 20 years. There was not any case that I prosecuted where the crime was more vile or cruel than the torture and murder of the Sumners." Judge Weatherby added, "This court has had a hard time in coming up with a manner of death that could be more heinous, atrocious, or cruel, or more painful and vile." Tiffany later asked the families for forgiveness in a letter she wrote to them. Some members of the family say they have forgiven her for their own sense of peace. Alan Wade later revealed to the media he had met a woman online named Sigrid, whom he married and had a child with. Sigrid had been writing to inmates on death row when she started talking to Alan, and this sparked a romantic relationship. Despite conjugal visits not being permitted at uni and correctional institution where Alan is being held, Sigrid somehow managed to get pregnant. A 2016 U.S. Supreme Court ruling found that Florida's prior law permitting non-unanimous jury verdicts and death penalty cases actually violated the Sixth Amendment, prompting Florida to re-sentence more than 150 people. The state court said anyone sentenced after a 2002 ruling could now be eligible for a new hearing and possibly a new sentence. And because of this, in 2017, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a new sentence hearing for Tiffany Michael James Jackson, was previously sentenced to death with an 8-4 majority ruling, and Alan Lindell Wade was sentenced with an 11-1 majority ruling. Neither had unanimous verdicts, so they will likely get new hearings as well. Some days when Rhonda's phone rings, she said she often forgets, and for a second hopes her mother is on the line. Reggie and Carol Sumner had found happiness together after years apart and after so many years of pain and troubles in their own lives. They were a kind, generous, and loving couple. All they wanted to do was spend their later years together. Their caring and giving nature will always be remembered by their family, and Rhonda keeps Carol and Reggie's ashes in an urn at her home so that the couple can stay together forever. Noelle was born on June 28, 1991, and in 2017, she was 25 years old. Brian, born on July 7, 1987, grew up in Fort Wayne with his sister, Amber Nicole Lash. As a child, Brian was known for getting into mischief. It's not known exactly when Brian and Noelle met and married, but they lived together in an apartment at 4811 Weiser Park Avenue in Fort Wayne. They had a young son named King Richard. Brian also had 2 daughters named Olivia Joyce Lash and Alexis Marie Lash, but the details of their mother are unclear. Both Noelle and Brian supported their family by selling marijuana. The drug deals were usually done in locations far away from their home. However, these deals were sometimes conducted within their home. It was a risky business, as the drug trades often brought them in contact with all sorts of dangerous people. Brian and Noelle were well aware of the dangers, but the profit they were making from the business kept them going. However, things got really messy when they least expected it. On June 9, 2017, Noelle and Brian decided to organize a party at their home. It wasn't something big, but was more of a get-together. What the couple had in mind was to invite a few family members and friends over for a barbecue and then watch the Cleveland Cavaliers and Golden State Warriors basketball game that was happening that evening. They also planned to use the opportunity to sell marijuana to those who wanted to purchase it. It was a good plan for them, as it would give them a chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They began to make preparations, an expectation of their visitors. Once the evening came around, those that they had invited began to gradually arrive, and pleasantries were exchanged. Amongst those who showed up were Noelle's sister and her boyfriend. A friend of the couple, known as Dustin Neal, was also one of those who attended the party. Noelle and Dustin had known each other since they were kids. At around 9 p.m., the game which they had all gathered to watch began, and they all sat down with plates of barbecue and bottles of drink in hands to enjoy it. The atmosphere became increasingly noisy due to the noise made by the men whenever their favorite team scored. In the end, the game ended with the Cavaliers winning. It was already late by this time, and the guests began to take their leave one after the other. Dustin also announced his departure and bade the couple goodbye. The people who remained were Noelle's sister and her boyfriend. With nothing left to do, someone suggested playing a card game, and the rest agreed to it. They all sat down to the game, and in no time were engrossed in it. Several hours went by, and it wasn't until 3 a.m. that they all decided that they had enough, then took their leave. Due to how exhausted Brian and Noelle were, they went straight to bed, telling each other that they would clean up the next morning. They had also made plans to meet up with Noelle's sister and mother for the New Haven Canals Day, an annual festival with plenty of family fun and entertainment. A few minutes before 10 a.m. on June 10, 2017, Noelle's sister and her mother, Kimberly Gomez, arrived at Brian and Noelle's home to check up on them. They had earlier called the couple's mobile phones to remind them of the plan they had made concerning the festival, but neither of them had picked up. Their thought was the two were likely tired from the previous night's party and had overslept. Noelle's sister and Kimberly knocked on the front door of the house, but got no response. It was dead silent, as well as the sound of vehicles in the distance. After knocking and calling out the couple's name to no avail, they decided to try the door and discovered that it was unlocked. They stepped into the unusually silent home and immediately knew that something was wrong. There was a faint smell in the air, but they could not immediately tell what it was. Noelle and Brian had not yet cleaned up, and this was obvious from how disorganized the living room was. There were bottles lying everywhere, as well as plates that had been used to serve barbecue to the guests the previous night. Amid the chaos, Noelle's sister noticed something odd. The about 50-inch Vizio TV that they had all watched the basketball game on the previous evening was missing. She also noticed that a video cassette recorder was nowhere in sight. A lot of things went through her mind in that instance, but none of it made any sense. She and her mother, Kimberly, made their way to the couple's bedroom, and that was when they saw the blood. The faint smell they had perceived upon entering the house was blood, and as they moved closer to the bedroom, it became stronger. At that point, their anxiety had doubled because they knew that something really bad had happened. When they opened the bedroom door, the blood was even more than they anticipated. On the bed were both Brian and Noelle. They were covered in blood, and it was obvious that they were both dead. They both had what looked like stab wounds all over their body, but it seemed as if Noelle had it the worst. There were empty, bloody holes in the place where her eyes should have been. Upon seeing the gory scene that looked like something out of a horror movie, Noelle and her mother simultaneously gasped in shock and screamed. They couldn't believe what was before their eyes. It was all too much to take. 911 was immediately dialed, and in a matter of minutes, police officers from the Fort Wayne Police Department arrived on the scene. They immediately secured the area and began to do a thorough sweep of the house in the hallway between the bedroom and kitchen. They noticed a black-colored object sitting on the floor. Upon closer inspection, it was discovered that it was a mobile phone that belongs to Noelle. The phone was kept as evidence. Officers took a look at different parts of the house and collected all that they believed would help them in their investigation. After this was done, Noelle and Brian's bodies were transported away for autopsy. 2 days after the murder took place, the autopsies of the dead couple were conducted by Dr. Scott Wonger, and the results showed both had died as a result of fatal stab wounds. The result also made detectives believe that before Noelle died, she had tried to shield herself from her attacker. This was due to the defensive wounds to her hands, arm, legs, and feet. The result of the autopsy allowed the couple's death to be ruled as a homicide, and Detective D. Engelman was one of those placed in charge of investigating the case. The first thing he did was interview the friends and families of the deceased couple. One of those that he interviewed first was Noelle's sister. When asked about what she knew, she told the detective about the party that had been organized the night before the murder and stated the number of people that had been present. In addition to this, she revealed to the detective that her sister, Noelle, was selling marijuana and that the majority of people who had attended the party were there because they wanted to purchase the drug. She also mentioned the missing TV and VCR she had noticed. On the 14th of June, 2017, detectives decided to take a closer look at the items that had been taken from the couple's home. They knew these items could potentially provide the answers that were needed to solve the case. Noelle's black mobile phone, which was found in the hallway, was examined for fingerprints. The process was carried out by latent print examiner Pam Shannon. Noelle's fingerprints were found all over the phone. However, another fingerprint that did not belong to her was also found on it. Even though it was a partial fingerprint, detectives were not discouraged, but began working around the clock to find a match. At first, they speculated that the fingerprint might belong to Brian, but after checking through their database, they quickly discovered that they were wrong. The fingerprint belongs to 30-year-old Dustin, the couple's friend. Detectives realized that Dustin was among the people they had not interviewed and decided to do just that. The interview was conducted on June 17, 2017, which was a day before both Noelle and Brian's bodies were laid to rest. What detectives saw when Dustin sat down for an interview with them was a man who was still mourning the loss of his friends. When questioned, Dustin revealed that he had known Noelle and her sister for about 20 years, and went on to talk about the good times they had spent together. He told detectives that he was often at Noelle and Brian's house due to how close he was with them. When asked about the drug trade the couple was involved in, he responded that he was aware of it. Dustin also said that Noelle had about 2 to 3 pounds of marijuana, which was worth a lot of money. But according to him, no drug deal occurred on the night of the party. He also told Detective Engelman that after leaving the party, He had gone straight to his mother's house, also located within the city. He had not stayed there for long, and had later gone on to a friend's trailer in New Haven, and that was where he spent the night. One final question for him. He looked Dustin in the eyes and asked if he went back to Noelle and Brian's apartment after leaving that night. Dustin responded that he hadn't, and with this, he was allowed to go home. Detectives decided to interview the friend whose trailer Dustin claimed he had spent the night at. On the 20th of June, 2017, which was 10 days after the murder, Dustin's friend was interviewed by detectives, and he was able to confirm that all that Dustin had said was the truth. He told them that he had been at work when Dustin arrived at his home, but he was able to get in because he had a spare key. With this, detectives had no further leads in the case and the heat of the investigation died down. Dustin remained on the police's radar. They strongly believed that he knew more than he was telling them. However, due to a lack of solid evidence, they could only watch and wait. It would take more than a year for the investigation to pick up once again. Detectives were able to locate an individual who had been in contact with Dustin at the time of the murders. The individual, whose identity was not revealed, told detectives that Dustin had called him on the morning of June 10, 2017, saying that he had a large amount of marijuana he wanted to sell. According to the unidentified individual, Dustin sounded uneasy over the phone. The marijuana he was trying to sell was high grade and was about 1 to 2 pounds. He told detectives that he had been surprised by the offer and wondered how Dustin had gotten the drug in his possession. This was because at the time, Dustin was broke and there was no way he could have bought so much. Dustin shot to the top of the detective suspect list. To confirm that what the unidentified individual had told them was the truth, they took a look at cell phone records, and it showed that phone calls had been exchanged between Dustin and the unidentified individual on the morning of the murder. Almost 3 months after this, detectives interviewed Dustin once more. This time around, the interview was not conducted by Detective Engelman, by Detective Brian Martin, also of the Fort Wayne Police Department. Dustin maintained all he had said the last time he was interviewed, but this time around, he added that he drank beer and smoked marijuana upon getting to his friend's trailer house in New Haven, and that was where he had been when he heard about the murder. They did not ask him about the marijuana he had allegedly tried to sell, but allowed him to leave. Detectives spoke with Dustin's friend who resided in New Haven, and he confirmed to them that Dustin was selling marijuana from his trailer on the day of the homicide. After this, detectives sat down to carefully review all the available information, and it suddenly dawned on them that nothing they had was solid enough to link Dustin to the murders or build a case against him. They needed something more that would prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had been Noelle and Brian's killer. And without this, there was little that could be done. The pace of the investigation slackened, and things went quiet in the blink of an eye. 5 years had gone by since the murder of Noelle and Brian. Then, just when detectives least expected it, another individual came forward and gave them a testimony that helped them finally solve the case. The individual was a man by the name of Tyler. He had not been happy with the way the investigation had dragged on for years, and so he decided to speak to the authorities and tell them everything he knew about the murder. "I just felt like I had to do the right thing," Tyler said. On July 28, 2022, Tyler was interviewed by detectives after telling them that he knew something about Noelle and Brian's murders. He revealed that he was friends with a man named Dean, and during one of their conversations, Dean had once informed him that his half-brother had carried out the killing. As it turns out, the half-brother who Dean had been talking about was none other than Dustin. According to what Dean told Tyler, Dustin had gone to the couple's house in the early hours of June 10, 2017 to steal some marijuana. He had believed that no one would be at home. Armed with only a knife, he had climbed through a window into the house and had proceeded to the bedroom to look for what he had gone there to steal. However, the noise he made woke Brian, and upon seeing that his cover was blown, he stabbed him. In the commotion, Noelle also woke up and Dustin stabbed her as well. She had, however, put up a fight, and he had responded by stabbing her multiple times. He had bragged to Dean that he stabbed her so hard in the face that the knife got stuck and he had to put a foot on her body and pull to retrieve the knife. After killing the couple, he had stole the marijuana and gone to his friend's place in New Haven, where he burnt his bloody clothes in a fire pit. By the time Tyler finished his narration, detectives could hardly believe their ears. They knew that, with the testimony, the case was closer to being solved than ever. But they had to confirm Tyler's word, and for this, they interviewed Dean, Dustin's half-brother. Throughout the interview, his words were consistent with what Tyler had earlier told them. On the 31st of October 2022, Dustin's cell phone was analyzed by an FBI detective. It was a final and important step that had to be taken to ensure that they were not chasing shadows. Well, as it turned out, the results of the analysis showed that Dustin had been near Noel and Brian's residence between 6:20 a.m. and 6:04 a.m. on June 10, 2017, which was the day of the murder. This was in contrast to what he told detectives about not going back there after leaving the party. In December 2022, officers arrested Dustin in Wells County and charged him with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder, and 2 counts of robbery resulting in bodily injury. Detectives are pleased that they had finally brought the case to a close by making the arrest. They were also grateful for the witnesses who came forward and provided crucial information that was helpful to the case. If it was your family, your loved one who was taken from you in a violent way, you would want someone with that information to come forward. You would hope they would do it right away. But if they come forward at all and can provide that information and sit down with us, it usually brings good stuff to the case that we can use and move forward with evidence. Detective Martin told the media following Dustin's arrest. At the moment, Dustin remains in jail, awaiting punishment for his crime. It is a relief that Noel and Brian's murder has been finally solved. And through this, their families have been able to get the much-needed closure that they deserve. But do you think there is a chance that Tyler's life might be in danger since this testimony was what finally solved the case? Let us know your thoughts. Comments section. Alicia Navarro is known as a bright and caring young girl with dreams of becoming a surgeon someday. Her mother, Jessica Nunez, describes her as loving and compassionate, always showing concern for animals and people alike. Despite facing some challenges in school, Alicia threw herself into her studies and excelled in her subjects. Jessica mentioned that Alicia had developmental delays as she grew up, such as learning to walk and being a picky eater from a young age. Alicia had specific preferences, often wearing the same clothes repeatedly and preferring to wear sweaters regardless of the weather. As Alicia got older and was still facing some challenges, Jessica and her husband took her to the doctors for an evaluation. Alicia was then diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. As of 2013, Asperger's syndrome is no longer given as an official diagnosis, as it became part of the umbrella diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Alicia was also diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. She had a small but close group of friends she had known since childhood, but Alicia mostly kept to herself a lot of the time. She often found it difficult, sometimes impossible, to leave the family home due to her anxiety. Sometimes Alicia would be so distressed about the thought of leaving home, she would curl up in a ball on the floor and scream. Jessica said she wishes she had picked up on certain things earlier to obtain a diagnosis quicker, as by the time she was diagnosed, Alicia was coming up against the challenges of hormonal changes too. Alicia had a big passion for gaming and spent a lot of time in various online communities, often staying up throughout the night to play and interact with people on games, chat rooms, and servers. Jessica had several conversations with Alicia about internet safety and protecting herself online. It came to her attention that someone was asking Alicia for private information. The person she was talking to then asked her if she liked stuffed animals and said, "I can be your stuffed animal." After this, Jessica took her phone away for a while to monitor things more closely and reported this unsettling encounter to the police, but nothing came of it. Jessica did her best to carry on watching her daughter's online activity as much as she could, but believed that Alicia now understood the dangers of the kind of people that were out there online. Sometime before she went missing, changes in Alicia's personality started to happen. Alicia had asked for makeup and body sprays, another puzzling change, Jessica thought. She had never shown any interest in these things before, especially because of her sensory challenges. Anything that smelled too strong, Alicia would actively avoid. Her taste in music and clothing also started to change too. She was now listening to Pink Floyd rather than the current pop charts and asking for different types of clothing, such as a backless top. This clothing, Jessica considered to be way out of her daughter's comfort zone. She also found this to be quite inappropriate for her age. In the months before she went missing, Alicia became obsessed with getting hold of a particular comic book called Demon in a Bottle, which was from the Iron Man series. It cost around $200, but Alicia was so desperate to own it and Jessica ended up buying it for her. But when the comic book arrived, Jessica was surprised to see her daughter didn't open or read it. In fact, she hardly even seemed to look at it. Alicia also started asking to go out with friends, and everyone recognized what a massive step this was in many ways. One day she went to the mall with 2 male friends from school, staying out with them for a few hours. One of the boys knew that Alicia was skilled in coding and wanted her to join the school robotics club. When Alicia came home that day, she commented to her mom that she liked how one of the boys looked and said that he was very physically fit. After this, Alicia started to focus on health, fitness, and working out herself. Everyone was happy to see such progressive changes in Alicia, and her family was so proud of the leaps she was making socially. She had just started the year at a Catholic high school, but in the few days before she was last seen, her anxiety was very high and she stayed home from school. On Saturday, September 14th, with Alicia's anxiety still high, Jessica wanted to take her out to take her mind off things and spend some quality time together. Alicia got her eyebrows threaded and the pair went to get McDonald's so she could eat one of her favorite foods, McDonald's chicken nuggets. Jessica recalled that Alicia was in good spirits and the pair had a really lovely day together. Around 1 a.m. on what was now September 15th, Jessica was up and waiting for her husband to come home from work. Jessica heard Alicia laughing upstairs before coming downstairs to grab a glass of water. She was chatty and happy and asked her mom why she was still awake and when she was planning on going to bed. After this, she returned to her room. At around 2 a.m., Jessica's husband returned home and he stayed up to watch TV. Jessica then headed to sleep with her youngest 2 children in their room, and her husband eventually fell asleep on the couch, exhausted after working 2 jobs that day. A few hours later at 7 a.m., Jessica was making breakfast for her husband and Alicia's brother and sister. Jessica said that Alicia didn't often join the family for breakfast, and instead liked having a Starbucks at around 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings. But as she was preparing breakfast, Jessica noticed that the back door was slightly open. Assuming that her husband may have forgotten to shut it after letting the dogs out, she initially didn't think much of it. But when he confirmed he hadn't left it open, Jessica became worried that someone had broken in. She sent her husband upstairs to check on Alicia, but Alicia wasn't in her room and she was nowhere in the house. Jessica went outside and saw some chairs stacked against one of the walls at the edge of their backyard. It had rained heavily the night before and there was only one pair of footprints in the mud leading away from the house. It was Alicia's pair of Vans. There was another bit of wall near the gate which had a shovel leaning against it, which looked to have been used by Alicia to climb onto to get over the gate. The gate was unlocked and she could have pushed it open. However, it is thought she jumped over it to avoid making any noise. A note was found on Alicia's desk that read, "I will be back, I swear. I'm sorry. Alicia." Handwriting analysis confirmed this was written by Alicia Navarro. She had taken her small backpack which had cat ears on it, as well as her silver MacBook Pro, her iPhone, her $200 comic book, and some makeup. But her charges for devices and her medication were all left in her room. People think this did indicate to a certain degree that she had every intention of returning home at some point. Others also speculate she may have taken the comic book with her to give to someone as a gift, which is why potentially Jessica didn't see Alicia open or read it. Jessica thinks that her daughter may have been wearing a sweatshirt, a white-washed denim skirt, and her black and white Vans. The whole situation was more than just simply out of character for Alicia, and Jessica was petrified. Jessica said that as well as Alicia struggling to leave the house, she couldn't take public transport by herself and would find it impossible to cope with being out in public, alone and fending for herself. She immediately called the police. Jessica had to fight hard to get a silver alert on Alicia's case. A silver alert is a type of public notification system that aims to broadcast information about vulnerable missing persons throughout the United States. For the Glendale police, this was the first silver alert that was issued for a child in Arizona. Looking at the way in which she left the house that morning, Alicia's family thinks she chose to exit through the back door rather than the front to avoid her neighbor's security camera, and to avoid waking her stepdad up, who was asleep on the sofa. Jessica still does not know whether Alicia got outside via hers or her husband's bedroom, or whether she went directly past her stepfather on the sofa, but nobody heard anything and the dogs were not alerted to any noise either. Since the start of the investigation, Jessica has fought tirelessly in so many ways to keep her daughter's case active, and initially, Jessica said it was very much down to her to go door to door and track down things like CCTV footage. Some of the surveillance footage Jessica managed to get from the neighbors' cameras showed a white truck entering and leaving the neighborhood around the time Alicia disappeared. On September 19th, just 4 days later, a reported sighting of Alicia came in. She was allegedly seen with a much older male who was covered in tattoos, and the pair were walking together at around 4 p.m. in La Pradera Park, just over a mile away from her home. Jessica went straight to the park to investigate this tip, and someone that was regularly at this park confirmed they saw the same pair and they believed the young girl to be Alicia. But due to no surveillance footage around the area, sadly nothing came of this potential lead. September 20th marked Alicia's 15th birthday and her family felt sure she would return for it. But her birthday came and went and Alicia did not come home or contact her family. Prior to her disappearance, Jessica had found a golf ball-sized hole in Alicia's window screen. Alicia told her mom that a bird had caused it, but after her stepdad inspected it further, he found that the hole had been cut from the inside and not damaged from the outside. Jessica now wondered if Alicia may have been throwing notes to someone out of the window. Alicia had expressed a desire to go to a Comic-Con event, and some wondered if maybe she had met with someone on the basis they would be going to Comic-Con together. This could have possibly been somewhere she could have got her comic book signed. And before her disappearance, Alicia told some friends she had plans to run away, possibly to California. There were Comic-Con events in California and other neighboring states around the time of and shortly after Alicia's disappearance. When the boys she met at the mall that day were spoken to, one of the boys said that Alicia had a burner phone and a backpack on her when she went to meet them that day. But Jessica said this is impossible because she dropped Alicia off and she had nothing on her. The other boy said that Alicia had spoken to him about running away and asked him if he wanted to go too. 10 days after she disappeared, the FBI got involved in the case. As well as talking to people in person, the police and the FBI knew Alicia was very tech-savvy and had a whole separate life online. This was something they were keen to look more closely at, believing that this would hold the answers to her disappearance. But despite the FBI analyzing many conversations she'd had with people online, as well as obtaining warrants and spending countless weeks and months interviewing people, nothing has ever turned up. Joe Santiago with the Glendale Police Department said, "There's nothing that specifically says that she has come in contact with someone or any individuals online." Another person that offered some more insight was a 20-year-old man named Clark who lived in Oregon. Alicia was good friends with him and confided in him a lot, and the pair often spoke over Discord. Alicia had told him that she had recently sold the Xbox she loved so much and that she had a new boyfriend. She also mentioned learning to play the electric guitar and joining a band with one of the boys she went to the mall with. But Clark wasn't entirely sure that she was telling the truth. He said she often made up elaborate stories and it was hard to get to the bottom of what was true and what wasn't. Multiple witness accounts have also suggested that Alicia may have been involved in 2 overlapping relationships, both of which ended in difficult breakups. But again, sadly, nothing has ever come from these tips. Despite her taking her MacBook Pro and iPhone with her, neither of these have been used since the time she disappeared, and the last time Alicia was active and online was the morning she went missing at 3:26 a.m. Jessica and many others fear that she may have unknowingly met a predator online who lured her away after gaining her trust. Jessica said, "I just feel like she's in danger. She would have never been gone this long, not without getting in touch with me. Someone has her." The family has also partnered with the nonprofit organization, the Anti-Predator Project, made up of current law enforcement officers doing their own private investigations into the case. The Anti-Predator Project is dedicated to combating human trafficking in the United States. They specialize in criminal investigations into individuals and organizations that are involved in human trafficking and the location and recovery of American children that may have been kidnapped or sold on the black market. They also help and support with witness and victim protection and missing children. Toby Braun is an investigator with the Anti-Predator Project, and he said, "We at least feel that Alicia met someone online and she left her house that night. When she made contact with that person, she realized the person she made contact with probably wasn't the person she thought he was, which was a friend, and that it clearly wasn't a friend, and that was the last time she has ever been seen or heard of." Jessica still has hope that she will be reunited with her daughter at some point, and fights tirelessly to keep Alicia's story active in the media. The first Alicia Navarro Community Awareness Day was held on Saturday, July 31st at Dream City Church, with various speakers talking about the dangers of what can be out there online, and helping to raise awareness and keep Alicia's case active and alive. Jessica is still trying to raise as much money as possible to continue paying for billboards that show her daughter's face and information about her case. At the time she disappeared, Alicia was 4 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 95 pounds. She has brown hair, brown eyes, and braces. Alicia Navarro will turn 17 in September this year, and her loved ones are still working immensely hard to find her. I've left all the relevant links in the description box should anyone wish to leave information or an anonymous tip that relates to the disappearance or whereabouts of Alicia Navarro. On January 6, 1982, a severe winter storm battered Colorado. Sheriff Harold Bray from Denver was on a flight to California, hoping to escape the snowy blizzards below. However, his plans took an unexpected turn when he noticed something out of the ordinary through the plane's window. Flashing lights caught his attention, a familiar SOS distress signal. 3 short, 3 long, and 3 short pulses of light. Bray immediately alerted the pilot, who recorded the coordinates and contacted the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. The FAA dispatched 2 smaller planes to investigate the signal. They were able to quickly find the source of the lights. It was a pickup truck. 2 vehicles equipped to handle the whiteout conditions were sent out. In a string of miraculous events, rescued a man. 30-year-old Alan Phillips had become stranded crossing the Colorado Mountain Pass. He had been traveling without snow chains and his truck became stuck. He had heard a plane flying overhead and used his headlights to flash the distress signal. He had no idea his plan could work. The plane had been flying over 1,000 feet overhead, but it was 20 below and he had run out of options. He had already come to terms with the likelihood of freezing to death in his vehicle. Phillips was asked by law enforcement why he was out there in the middle of the night during a snowstorm, and he claimed that he'd been caught unexpectedly driving from Bailey, Colorado to his hometown in Georgetown. He said he'd spent the evening at a bar and wasn't thinking clearly. The rescue made national headlines, both in applauding Bray's heroic catch, as well as a cautionary tale to remind people to prepare their vehicles for appropriate weather. Phillips was dropped off at home after a long conversation about winter safety, and no one thought much more about it after that. On January 7th, only a day after the Alan Phillips rescue, a grisly discovery was made. The body of a young woman was discovered off of Highway 9 near an overpass at the summit of Hosier Pass. The woman, later identified as Barbara Bobby Jo Oberholzer, had been reported missing by her husband Jeff the previous evening. Bobby Jo had called him after work that evening and let him know that she was going to be home late. A couple of people from work had invited her for drinks and she was going to stay out for a bit. She said she had intended to hitchhike home. This was common in Breckenridge. It was a ski resort town and it was common for people to hitchhike to and from there to surrounding communities. Bobby Jo and her husband lived in Alma, about 30 minutes away. She and her husband had lived in the area for a few years. He was in appliance repair tech, and she worked as a receptionist. It had been widely regarded as a safe community, and this murder case had been quite a shock to the locals. Bobby Jo had been shot twice in the chest. Her cause of death was blood loss from her injuries. She had been found 20 feet from the highway at the bottom of an embankment. Several belongings from her purse were also located, some as far as 20 miles along the highway headed towards Denver. A set of keys was found near Bobby's body, as well as an orange sock. The keys were determined to belong to Bobby, but what confused investigators was that the sock wasn't. Investigators made no secret of who they thought was responsible for the killing, Jeff Oberholzer. There wasn't any evidence tying him to the crime, but the police found it convenient that Jeff had no alibi as he claimed to have been home asleep. When he woke during the night, He got in his truck and headed to the pub that Bobby had been at. Her friends were surprised to see him and told him that she had left hours earlier around 7:38 o'clock. Jeff went to the police that night to report his wife missing, but officers wouldn't file a missing persons report. The next morning, a resident had called Jeff and said that he'd found his wife's driver's license on his property. Jeff drove over there and picked it up. Jeff got some friends together and they started searching along the highway. It was Jeff that spotted a blue backpack in the snow. They pulled over, and with the backpack, they also found Bobby's gloves splattered in blood and several tissues also covered in blood. It was at this point that Jeff was sent home to wait, and the search was put together with locals and law enforcement, and Bobby's body was found. Other evidence collected were shell casings from the presumed murder weapon, one set of footprints that belonged to Bobby, and a plastic cord tied around her wrist. The same day that Bobby Joe's body had been found, law enforcement also received another report of a missing woman. She was a waitress and housekeeper in Frisco, but lived in Blue River, all near Breckenridge. And like Bobby Joe, Annette was also known to hitchhike to and from work most days, and again for this community that was very normal. No additional evidence was found in connection to Annette's disappearance, and unfortunately due to bad weather, it had quickly been determined that if Annette's body was in a remote area like Bobby Joe's had been, it would be very difficult to recover after heavy snowfalls. Jeff was interviewed multiple times. He initially claimed to not know Annette, but later called officers to let him know that he'd met her once. He'd been watching the news and saw more photographs of her and realized he'd given her a ride months before her disappearance. Officers had asked Jeff to take a polygraph test, which he consented to and pass. He had always maintained his innocence as well as annoyance with law enforcement's insistence that he had something to do with his wife's murder. 6 months after Annette's disappearance, her body was located on July 6, 1982. She was found in a rural area in Park County, 20 miles from where she was last seen. She had been shot once in the back and had also died from blood loss from a gunshot wound. Annette had been sexually assaulted, and it appeared that she may have been redressed by her killer or been forced to redress quickly as her clothing was in disarray, noticeably missing an orange sock. Officers put together a framework of what they believed had happened on January 6th. They estimated that Annette had been picked up first, around 5 p.m. The suspect drove her to a remote area, sexually assaulted her, and Annette had escaped the vehicle. Her killer had shot her once in the back and left her to die. The man then went back to Breckenridge, where he found a second victim, Bobby Joe, and abducted her. Bobby Joe had not been assaulted, and she had been shot in the chest twice, which led investigators to believe that Bobby Joe may have been trying to reason with her attacker. Jeff said that Bobby would never have accepted a ride from a stranger. He had always believed it was someone from the area that she knew that had committed these murders. Officers had always believed both murders were committed by the same man. Jeff was cleared years later by DNA evidence. Other suspects had been a cab driver who had assaulted a hitchhiker in 1982, and while in jail he had bragged to a cellmate about committing 2 murders and getting away with it. Another suspect was Henry Lee Lucas. Another serial killer, Tracy Petrelli. All were cleared by DNA. 2 other persons of interest were also cleared by DNA. Was that a woman that had been talking to Annette before her abduction, and a man whose photograph was found in Annette's wallet. Neither were identified or found for questioning. The case eventually went cold. It had been featured in the media several times and was the subject of Unsolved Mysteries in 1991. It had been a case that had been actively worked for decades. They had the killer's DNA both from Annette's body and on the tissues and glove from Bobby's, and what they needed was for technology to catch up. In 2021, the case was put forward by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for Genetic Genealogy. At the time, it was recognized as a relatively new option for solving cold cases, but it seemed like the only hope to solve this case. And nearly 4 decades after the murders, they had a suspect. On February 24th, Alan Lee Phillips was arrested without incident. The 70-year-old mechanic was picked up in Dumont, Colorado, and arrested for 2 counts of kidnapping, murder, and assault. Phillips had lived in the area his entire life and had likely been known to both women. He is also being investigated on other crimes in the area as officers feel that due to the level of violence involved in the killings, these two women would be unlikely to be his only victims. When it was made public that Phillips was the killer, a man involved in the rescue operation that had saved Phillips in 1982 made the connection. That finally gave context as to why Phillips had been out on the Guanella Pass all those years ago. He had become stuck while fleeing the scene of the murder. No one had even put two and two together. In 1982, Phillips had been 31 years old. He had never been a suspect. He went on to marry, have children, and live his life. And I think Annette's sister's statement to the media says it's best. You had 39 years of freedom, and hopefully now it will all be taken away from you. 39 years of freedom too long. Phillips is being held in jail without bond while he waits trial. There have been several delays so far, but it is expected to go forward sometime this year. Laney was born in 1954 in Maryland, but many details about her early life remain unknown. By the age of 28, she was living in an apartment near Owen Brown Village Center and was raising 4 children. The identity of her children's father and whether they were together in the spring of 1982, when tragedy struck, are unclear. Laney's mother described her as a quiet woman who deeply loved her children and worked tirelessly to provide for them. Besides caring for her children, Laney enjoyed walking a lot. She often chose to walk to her destinations instead of using public transportation like buses or taxis. Perhaps she did this to stay fit, or maybe it was a habit she had gotten used to, or it could just have been to save money as a single mother supporting 4 children. But one day, the walk she took would be her last, and she never returned home. On March 29, 1982, Laney needed to go grocery shopping. She decided to go to a store located at the Owen Brown Village Center. She wanted to get what she needed and be back home as soon as possible. After writing a list of all that was needed and making sure that she had not forgotten anything, she stepped out of the house and made for the store. As usual, she was on foot and saw no reason to take a bus since where she was headed wasn't that far. It was a good day, the weather was fair, and there was no sign of rain. It seemed like just another regular day, but she had no idea that it would be her last on Earth. As she walked along Oakland Mills Road, a brown Ford LTD suddenly stopped beside her. She was a bit alarmed but continued walking, perhaps believing that whoever was behind the wheel had too much to drink. In a matter of seconds, the driver of the vehicle stepped out and much to her surprise, he walked up to her. He was a white male with long hair and he had on a bandana. The strange man ordered her to get into the vehicle, but she remained where she was and stared at him. When he saw she was not obeying, he grabbed her and pushed her inside the vehicle. Her screams did not go unnoticed by those that were in the vicinity at the time, but no one was able to help her. The strange man who had abducted her got into the driver's seat of the vehicle and zoomed off. That would be the last time anyone saw Laney alive. A few hours after this occurred, Howard County Police received a call from an unknown individual. The individual did not state the reason why he had called, but instead provided them with detailed directions to a location. Here is the recording of the mysterious call. "Talk to me, please, emergency. If you were heading northbound on Route 32, you took the first left after Hammond High. Go down the end of that street, take a left. Go down the end of that street and take a right. There's a little court. Look over the side of the curb, please." Before the operator could ask the caller any questions, he hung up. The police had a turn-by-turn description of a place they were familiar with, but they had no idea if something bad had happened there. However, they decided to look into it rather than turn a blind eye. In no time, officers had gotten into their vehicles and were on their way. A few minutes later, they arrived at the location that had been described by the caller. It was a wooded area, and there were no signs of life anywhere. Due to this, the officers began to suspect that the call from the unknown man had been a prank. As far as they could see, nothing seemed out of place. Only the occasional call of birds and the rustling of leaves broke the silence. There was a piece of land nearby that looks deserted from a distance, but officers decided to check it out to make sure they were not missing anything. On reaching there, they saw something they were not expecting. The body of a woman was sprawled on the ground and she was covered in blood. A small pool of blood had also formed around her. When officers moved closer, They realized that she had several stab wounds to her body and her throat had also been cut open. They could hardly hide their shock at the discovery. A dead woman was the last thing they had expected to find in such a place. Apart from the body, the lot was empty, and there was nothing significant that gave a hint as to what exactly happened to the woman. The only item laying around was an abandoned napkin, which the officers presumed belonged to the dead woman. Paramedics were called to the scene, and the body was transported to the hospital. When it was finally identified, it turned out to be Laney, who had been abducted earlier on her way to get groceries. Autopsy results revealed that she had died from multiple stab wounds, and in addition to this, that she had also been sexually molested. Her family were heartbroken by the news of her death, and they wondered who would have done such a cruel thing to her. "All I did was cry and ask. I wanted to know why." Katrina said of her mother's death, "What did she do that was so wrong? That she deserved what she got," she added. Detectives immediately began an investigation to determine exactly how Laney had met her end and who the person behind the killing had been. When they asked around, they learned from eyewitnesses about how she had been forced into a vehicle by an unknown man. A description of the man was given to the police by those who saw him. Detectives knew that the person they were looking for was a white man with long hair, but apart from that, there was nothing tangible that could help them successfully identify him. Then there was also the mystery caller to think about. Detectives knew that if they could find and talk to whoever it was, he might be able to provide answers to some of the questions they had. But they did not know where to begin looking for him. As time went by, detectives were unable to get any tangible information, and due to this, the case went cold. Miss Mcgadney died a brutal death. Howard County State's Attorney Rich Gibson said, she was raped. Her throat was slashed. She was stabbed over 30 times. And to have no answers to something like that, it's just terrible." Several years passed by and Laney's murder remained unsolved. However, in 2021, a breakthrough was made. Detectives occasionally examined the case to see if any new leads could be identified, and during one of these reviews, a detective discovered that one of the items that was collected from the murder scene back in 1982 was the napkin that they had assumed was Laney's. Not much attention had been paid to the napkin over the years because it seemed like an insignificant piece of evidence. However, an idea struck the detective. He wondered whether it was possible that the napkin had held the answer needed to solve the case all along. And due to this, he decided it was best to test it for DNA. The napkin was sent for testing at the lab, and a few months after this, the result was out. DNA that did not belong to Laney was found on the napkin. The DNA matched that of a 62-year-old by the name of Howard Jackson Bradbury. It was a new lead after over 3 decades, but it was not enough to name Bradbury as the killer right away. Detectives decided to take some additional measures in order to get to the truth. The investigative process remains classified, and so it's not known what additional information detectives were able to uncover concerning Bradbury. But after they were certain, without a doubt, that Bradbury was the man they had spent decades searching for, they decided to strike. May 25, 2021 was almost 40 years since Laney was murdered, and it was the day Bradbury was arrested at his home in Laurel. He was charged with 1 count each of first and second-degree murder, first and second-degree rape, and 1 count of kidnapping. He was locked up at the Howard County Department of Corrections and held on a $25,000 bond. After this arrest, detectives were praised for the role they played in bringing the case to a close. We hope that after nearly 40 years, Laney Mcgadney's family can have some kind of peace with this arrest. Howard Police Chief Lisa Myers has said in a press release, "Nothing will ever erase the pain of losing a loved one in such a violent and tragic way. Our cold case investigators are committed to bringing justice for victims and families, no matter how much time has passed," they added. Laney's surviving family members were also relieved after hearing about the arrest. They, however, remained saddened by the fact that Laney had not lived her life to the fullest. "She has a lot of grandchildren she never met," Katrina said to the media. In July 2021, during a court hearing, Bradbury entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain his or her innocence, but acknowledges that there is sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. On January 5, 2023, Bradbury was sentenced to 25 years in state prison for the abduction, sexual assault, and subsequent murder of Laney. In a press release after this, Howard County State's Attorney Rich Gibson had the following to say: "The brutal murder of Laney Mcgadney fractured her family beyond repair, and for 40 years, there were very few leads in the case, with no one being held responsible for her senseless killing. I want to thank Howard County Police and our prosecutors for working so diligently on this case. We know today's sentencing cannot bring back the matriarch of this family, but we do hope it provides some much-needed closure. For her 4 kids, 22 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren, knowing Bradbury will spend the rest of his life in prison for the innocent life he took and the heinous crime he committed. Bradbury might end up perishing in prison, but the hurt he has caused Laney's family will stay with them for a long time. But why do you think Bradbury carried out the crime in the first place? Had he and Laney known each other? Or was this a random attack? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.